Neither by the Samnites nor by the Carthaginians, not by Spain or Gaul, or even by the Parthians have we had more lessons taught to us. After all, what has the East to taunt us with except the slaughter of Crassus? But the Germans routed or captured Carbo, Cassius, Aurelius Scaurus, Servilius, Caepio, and Malleus Maximus, and robbed the Republic, almost at one stroke, of 5 consular armies. Even from Augustus they took Varus and 3 legions. This excerpt from Tacitus's Germania, published in 98 AD, exemplifies the position that the fearsome ancient Germanic people held in the Roman psyche. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire was the undisputed arbiter of the Mediterranean, yet in the bogs and forests of Germania it met its match. Their enemy, peerless warriors who revelled in violence, understood what it meant to let the Romans wage war on their terms, and what would happen if the Romans won. Time and time again, the Germanic tribes inflicted defeats on the Romans. Their martial prowess and ability to fight on their own terms repeatedly frustrated Roman ambitions. The Romans were forced to abandon all plans of conquest and establish a permanent line of fortifications that required a third of the entire Roman army to garrison. Germania would remain a foreign land, never to feel the laws of Rome. Welcome back to our next installment on life in the Roman world. In this episode, we will cover why Rome was unable or unwilling to conquer Germania. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. Why Rome was never able to conquer Germania has been a topic of debate among the scholarly community for decades, and a subject of inquiry in the minds of Roman contemporaries as well. When approaching this topic, the first aspect to consider is the geographic, climatic, and terrain obstacles of Germania. Tacitus introduces Germania to his Roman audience by invoking its alien nature. All Germania is separated from the Galli and the Pannoni by the Rhine and Danube rivers, and from the Sarmati and Daci by reciprocal fears or by mountains. Ocean surrounds the rest, embracing vast peninsulas and an immeasurable expanse of islands, where contained tribes and kings have only recently been made known to us, unveiled by war. This highlights the distinctly foreign nature of Germania in the Roman world. Both the Greek geographer Strabo and the Roman author Pliny the Elder tried to measure and explain Germania scientifically, despite their lack of knowledge of the area. Tacitus, however, presented Germania as mysterious, uninhabitable, harsh, and almost beyond human understanding. To the Romans, it was not just land across the Rhine, but a strange, hostile world set apart from their own. On top of being a mysterious, wild, and savage land that no civilized Roman should ever wish to set foot in, another factor preventing Rome from conquering Germany was its distance from the empire's heartland, combined with the perceived lack of value in its land. The gradual slowdown of Roman expansion was in part determined by the undesirable nature of the territories beyond their borders. When it came to expanding into, and then, more crucially, holding foreign territory, Rome had always enticed and coerced local chieftains to service their interests, whose lands and treasures Rome could threaten. Germania, in comparison, had little wealth which the Romans could leverage over the local rulers, and was generally considered not worth conquering. Yet, despite these limited prospects, Rome still committed significant manpower to campaigns there. For example, during Tiberius's expeditions against the Germanic tribes beyond the Weser River in 4 AD, his forces consisted of approximately 3 legions, 3 alae of cavalry, and 9 auxiliary cohorts, totaling around 27,500 men, plus 3,800 horses and over 7,000 mules. The daily requirements of an army of that size was 56 metric tons of food and fodder per day. Soldiers carried around 17 days' worth of rations themselves, leaving the total operational range for the army at around 24 days, before regular resupply became impossible. The success of the Roman army was not due to its ability to field the largest, best armed and best commanded army. Instead, the true strength of the Roman legion lay in logistics, and if logistics failed, so did the campaigns. To project power deep into Germania's interior, Rome would require the maintenance of long supply lines, the construction of forts and roads, and the deployment of garrisons far from central bases. The costs for all this ranged into the astronomical. Thus, for Rome, Germania was logistically too difficult to cover, both from a fiscal and manpower perspective. Thus, after an initial series of failed attempts to conquer and hold northern Europe, the Romans instead adopted the limites, which was a strategy of mobile defense that allowed the defenders to move against any invaders, and were prepared to fight offensively at the tactical level. According to modern estimates, the population density of Germania was larger than generally assumed. Villages were often within sight of each other, a fact which ran contrary to Roman sources, which described the land as an endless primeval forest. Consequently, ancient Germany must have featured plenty of flat, fertile land, which allowed for major agricultural practices and supported a large population with which to fight their enemies. However, despite ancient Germania's abundant agricultural potential, which has been fully realized in modern Germany, the Romans knew very little about the region and considered it a wild and untamed backwater. The seeming lack of a taxable population and scant resources provided few incentives for large-scale settlements or colonization, especially compared to the rich and fertile lands of Gaul and Hispania. The economic benefits of conquering and holding Germania were an unattractive option for the empire. A major factor explaining Rome's failure to meaningfully conquer and hold land in Germania was the decentralized nature of its natives. The ancient Germanic people were never a unified nation, but were instead divided into small autonomous tribes. Unlike the Gauls of what is now France, the Germanic tribes held no major strategic strongholds, such as Alesia and Gergovia, which the Romans could conquer and use to consolidate their control over the wider region. Consequently, Rome built its own strongholds in Germania, but the empire's attempts to impose suzerainty over the surrounding tribes from these local power centers ultimately failed. Rome's attempt at conquering ancient Germany had proved ineffectual at the best of times, and disastrous at the worst. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD was particularly devastating for Roman expansion, as it resulted in the loss of 3 full legions, along with their eagles. For the tribes of Germania, it was a battle whose outcome changed the whole course of their history. The total loss of these 3 legions effectively ended any designs for permanent conquest, and instead forced the Romans to adopt defensive positions along the Rhine. Although the Roman general titled Germanicus successfully campaigned for years against the Germans, annihilating entire tribes and rescuing 2 of the 3 lost eagles, his efforts were ultimately fruitless. While the materialistic impact of Teutoburg had been avenged with Germanicus's triumph in 17 AD, the psychological impact of the defeat was still felt. Arminius, a former Roman ward turned traitor who led the ambush at the Teutoburg Forest, had not been captured, and the war had not been brought to a resolution. This ever-present enemy would remain on the borders of the empire for the next 400 years. Emperor Marcus Aurelius attempted to conquer Germania in his Marcomannic Wars, but the result was the status quo ante bellum, or the situation as it existed before the war. In the centuries following their initial clashes along the Rhine and Danube, the Germanic peoples left a profound imprint on the Roman psyche. Battles like Teutoburg and the failure of the Marcomannic Wars had significant political consequences in Rome, including a loss of prestige, a shattering of Roman superiority, and a fear of overextension. The defeats suffered at the hands of the Germanic tribes undermined the Romans' belief in their own invincibility and discouraged continued aggressive expansion in that part of the empire. This attitude is reflected in Hadrian's defensive policies across the empire. Roman public opinion, senatorial politics, and the emperor's image all played a role in the Roman military machine. Victories made leaders popular, but massive disasters could destabilize politics and even cause mutiny or revolt. Instead, as Tiberius enforced, the greatest successes in Germania had actually been by cooperative policies, in which the Germans were incorporated into the empire as allies and trade partners. This is exactly what happened centuries later on a much greater scale, when a lack of military manpower forced Rome to rely heavily on Germanic recruits. first as individuals, then as entire peoples, to fight her wars and protect her borders. Additionally, no amount of Roman propaganda could conceal the fact that Drusus had been fighting the Germanic Cherusci tribe in 11 BC, and that 27 years later, his son Germanicus was still fighting that same tribe. All the wars of the previous 3 decades had achieved nothing but to further militarize the already dangerous Germanic tribes. The hardships that the Roman military endured in its wars with the Germans ultimately led to the tribe's freedom from Roman annexation and assimilation, enabling Germanic nations, such as the Franks, Angles, and Saxons, to conquer Gaul and Britannia centuries later. This, in turn, gave rise to the countries of Germany, France, and England. In summary, Germania was a world that would not bow to Rome. One of the primary reasons why Rome never conquered Germania was the overextension of the empire's resources. The borders of the empire were manned by an estimated 500,000 troops, spanning approximately 7,500 kilometers. This equated to roughly 1 soldier every 20 meters, covering the breadth of the empire's borders. Due to Rome's many strategic imperatives, the designs for the Roman conquest of Germania were adversely affected. The eastern frontier, internal stability, constant rebellions, provincial management, succession crises, and financial burdens routinely drew focus and resources away from the northern frontier. Given that defense against the Germanic peoples already absorbed over a third of the entire Roman army, the feasibility of redeploying more legions to attempt conquest was an absurdity to imperial security. Additionally, the marginal benefit of conquering Germania did not outweigh the costs, especially when the wealth and strategic lands available in the east were far more lucrative. Parthia and the Danubian frontier were of excellent value to Rome economically and strategically. The lands were rich, had extensive trade routes, and often came with political prestige. Once Rome had stabilized Gaul, gains east of the Rhine involved diminishing returns, despite the theoretically shorter border along the Danube and Elbe rivers that the Romans had pictured. Additionally, the resource costs of conquest, such as establishing garrisons, building roads, establishing loyal administrations, and placing settlers, were weighed against the benefits, and ultimately Germania simply offered less when compared to its European neighbours. The final factor that held Rome back from politically assimilating the land of the Germanic peoples, as they had the lands of the Greeks, Gauls, and Egyptians, was the cultural and ideological chasm that existed between Rome and the Germanic tribes. Romans generally considered themselves a civilizing force. War and conquest were often associated with the idea of introducing civilized society, order, cities, law, and culture to the conquered lands, with rare exceptions in Greece and Egypt, which the Romans considered as civilized as themselves. It was one thing to conquer, it was another to assimilate stably and permanently. What quickly became apparent to Tiberius and the Roman elite was that alliances were more suitable for managing Germania than conquest. The cultural divide between Rome and Germania made integration deeply challenging. Even in writing, the Germanic peoples maintained their own traditions, continuing to use the runic script they had adopted from the Phoenicians for centuries, despite the growing influence of Latin. Their very names reflected difference. While Romans employed the formal trinomina of 3 parts, Germanic names were typically diphthematic, single names formed by joining to stem words. Their legal practices contrasted just as sharply. Roman law was codified, written, and universal, whereas Germanic law remained oral, rooted in ritual. Each case required the community to find the law, using symbolic gestures, language, and ceremonies to produce a decision. Here, procedure mattered more than precedent, and justice was whatever the community judged fair in the moment. The same divergence was clear in military practice. Roman armies were disciplined, hierarchical, and professional. Germanic warriors were less regimented, with leaders guiding more by personal example than formal command. Most fought on foot, forming dense lines reminiscent of a Greek phalanx, while cavalry was limited to chieftains and their elite companions. Even the highest-ranking warriors usually dismounted to fight. Together, these differences in language, law, and warfare highlight why Germania resisted Romanization. The Germanic world operated on traditions and structures so unlike Rome's that assimilation was far more difficult than in provinces where cultural frameworks overlapped more closely with the Roman model. Many of the Germanic tribes eventually became foederati for the Roman army in the later stages of the empire, becoming an integral part of frontier defense and even becoming some of the most elite units in the army. However, despite the uptake in military recruitment, the tribes did not absorb much of Roman culture, even in their Roman deployments. In many cases, the reverse happened. When soldiers were off duty, they were free to observe any conceivable cult or religious practices, as long as they did not conflict with public law and order or interfere with their military service obligations. For example, the soldiers of Legio I Minervia, stationed along the Rhine frontier at Bonn, were enthusiastic followers of the cult of local motherly deities, or the matrons, particularly the Germanic matron goddess Matrone Alphaniae. Throughout Rome's history, the Germanic peoples were always a thorn in the side of the empire. Whether it was the roaming tribes that caused devastation in northern Italy during the time of the Republic, or the repeated defeats and setbacks they suffered during the time of the empire, Rome failed to militarily defeat their foe in their entirety. Instead, after accepting the fact that Germania would remain an unconquerable land, Rome's efforts centered on supporting tribal conflicts, improving trade, and patrolling the Rhine. In the end, Rome learned that Germania could not be conquered, only contained. More videos on the life and society of the ancient Romans are on the way. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.